This morning we're going to be looking at the topic, I am the resurrection and the life. And it is appropriate because today, as you know, is Easter. And I was thinking this past week that this is my 62nd Easter. Now, some of them I don't remember. And I was thinking through, and probably this is my 41st, 42nd sermon on Easter. Easter, thinking about the resurrection of Jesus. His resurrection never gets old for me. And I hope it never gets old for you. The resurrection is all about the nuts and the bolts of the Christian life. I was thinking of how crucial it is to constantly be aware of the foundation of what we believe. We could have a lesson this morning, and I thought about going this direction, of all of the traditions associated with Easter, but may not necessarily contribute to the meaning of resurrection, what Jesus was all about. And that tends to happen. Who would have thought that when Jesus came forth from the grave, that by 2016, it would have been associated with children hunting eggs on the front lawn of a church building. And we get a lot of traditions built up around things we believe and practice. What we don't ever want to do is to allow those practices to eclipse the very meaning of the event itself. And as we think about Jesus making the statement, I am the resurrection and the life, we want to be aware that in John 11, verse 25, where Jesus makes this statement, it's in the context of 7 clear statements that he makes about himself that are unique claims. And we don't have time to go through all of those. But you may remember hearing about many of them. I am the bread of life, Jesus claims. I am the light of the world, he claims. I am the gate, and if anyone wants to go through the Father, you have to go through me. I'm the good shepherd, he claims. He also, in our lesson, I am the resurrection and the life, we're going to come back to that. I am the way, truth, and life. I am the true vine. And then, as if to cap off those 7 I am sayings, in John 8:25, Jesus is going to say, truly I tell you, before Abraham was born, I am. What a strange way to say that. Because you would think he would have said something like, before Abraham was born, I was. But he doesn't say that. Before Abraham was born, I am. His pre-existence, but his presence. The resurrection. Jesus says, I am the resurrection. He didn't just say that he was resurrected. He didn't say that I represent the resurrection. I am the resurrection. He embodies the act, the reality of it, the promise and the blessings of being raised. He is risen. You know why this is so important? Just within the last couple of months, I think about my mother having died. I think about David Fleer's son. I think about the Scott family in the Highland View losing Selba. I think about the Wright family in Highland View losing Jane. It creates a deep longing and expectation of the reality of the resurrection. That what we see here and now is not the end of it. We do anticipate being with those that we love in Christ. In the context of John 11, where our verse comes from, Mary and Martha and others, they were concerned because Lazarus had died. And Jesus, when he finds out that Lazarus is sick and on the verge of death, and his disciples know that he is, why don't we go and be with the family? And Jesus says, no, let's wait. And Jesus waits because he wants them to see the glory of the work of God. And it's in this context that we have Jesus saying, I am the resurrection and the life. And what we're going to do this morning in the brief time that we have, I want to walk ourselves backwards through the Gospel of John and begin with his final exclamation that the resurrection is about light. And then we're going to see that he'll move to the resurrection of Lazarus. And then in chapter 5, he's going to talk about the general resurrection that all of us are going to participate in. In John 20 and verse 1, John uniquely says, as he describes the resurrection, now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. It was still dark. The word dark and darkness for John is more than just the sun not shining. Early on in his gospel, he talks about the darkness of the human spirit, that there are people who love the darkness. They love the darkness to hide their motives and their deeds. And it is the resurrection of Jesus that is light. And in this particular part of John chapter 20, Mary Magdalene plays an important part. She comes to the tomb, and in John's gospel we found earlier in 1925, she's standing by the cross of Jesus, where his mother and his mother's sister and wife, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene were. We also find that she is standing outside the tomb and weeping. But she stands to look inside the tomb, and Jesus is not there. The stone had been taken away. She didn't know that the angel, if you paid attention to the earlier reading from Matthew, we find out the angel came and moved that stone away. She wasn't sure who had moved the stone away. She did not expect this turn of events. She ran to go tell Simon Peter and the other disciple, that's presumably John himself. But there are two important things here. The significant role that Mary plays as a witness to that empty tomb, and the model for spreading this terrifying good news. In the reading in Matthew, did you pick up that though they were terrified, yet for joy, they ran to tell the other disciples? There's this unusual mix of emotions. Standing in awe and sort of terrified at an empty tomb where the mind can't even comprehend what is going on, but at the same time, this joy knowing that somehow God had accomplished what Jesus had been talking about all along. While Jesus is still in the tomb, Mary waits. But when she goes to the tomb, he is not there. And when we think about the idea of darkness, for John, darkness can also talk about the condition of the human heart. That the only way you dispel darkness is with light. That darkness can be dark despair. That darkness can be a life just overwhelmed by sin. That darkness can be being lost and not knowing why you're even here. Not even knowing your purpose. That darkness can be isolation where you have just totally shut yourself off from all meaningful relationships. So while it's still dark in your own life, let Jesus bring the light of the empty tomb. The second thing, though, that we look at is from chapter 11:25. Even though one dies, Jesus says, the resurrection is life. The resurrection is life. For centuries in Christian thought, there's the idea that every spring, when things come to life, it is a symbol of the resurrection. I want you to think about that. It is the symbol of the resurrection. Nancy, my wife, has done something this year that we haven't done much in the past, and that is she found every little old flower pot, where you can buy flour in the little black pots. She saved all of those. And now I think we have 100 pots with little seeds coming up. All the way from tomatoes to flowers like zinnias, marigolds, and it's like resurrection and life. And it's been fascinating watching those little seeds in those little pots push through the ground. And depending on what the plant is, they all look different even after they come through the ground. We understand in the spring of each year, we see things anew. They start over. In the resurrection, Jesus says, I am the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And this is squarely set in the narrative of the death of Lazarus. They knew that Lazarus had died. The family was grieving. But the promise of Jesus rings down today for each one of us. Your brother will rise again. And each one of us sitting here this morning, where we've had to experience death in the family, I can't tell you, or I can't share with you, a more powerful verse and promise than that. Your family will rise again. Our brothers, our sisters, our mothers, our fathers, our aunts, our uncles, our grandparents will rise again. It's not an empty promise. Though they die, yet shall they live. The third thing is, Jesus says, the resurrection is hope. Mary said, yeah, Jesus, I know he'll rise. Martha said, I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Now, Martha had some concept of that last day. We're not told what. I'm sure that it was very common as it arose out of Jewish thought related to the last day. She even knew that it had some connection to the resurrection. But our Christian hope is tethered and tied down to the resurrection. That is the stake that goes in the ground, and everything else goes around it. It's the hope for the future that replaces despair from the past. Do we know that he'll rise? That's the part of our Christian faith that is solid, that we know. Our expectation and our hope is founded on that. Mary's statement of faith is clear. Even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give it, because I know he'll rise again on the last day. Both Mary and Martha represent for us statements of faith, certainty that we know of hope. The fourth thing is, the resurrection itself robs the tomb and leaves it empty. In John 11:17, Jesus says that he is the resurrection and the life. And when he came to the tomb, he found that Lazarus had already been dead for 4 days. Now, there's no chance of a swoon theory here. Martha is concerned that when they go to the opening of the tomb, that he's going to smell. There's going to be an odor. And it's interesting how our pragmatic concerns keep us so blinded to the potential work of God. And had we been in Martha's shoes, we probably would have said the same thing. And the Jews standing around were also so blinded to the fact that Jesus' power was about to be unleashed, because they wondered, well, couldn't this man who opened the eyes of the blind man also kept him from dying? You see, the only tomb robbers is the resurrection itself. God's power robbed that tomb of Jesus. You may be aware of the discovery of the pyramids in Egypt, and that over the years they've been plagued by tomb robbers, looting for items of historical value. But this particular tomb, that of Jesus, it was looted all right, but by the resurrection itself. You see, Lazarus' resurrection becomes a model of our own hope. It's a specific example that human beings, other than Jesus, will be raised by the power of Jesus and the power of God. Jesus who overcame death and gives us hope in the midst of our own death. Last of all, those who are buried are going to come out of the tomb for destiny. That destiny is described as either life or judgment. John 5:29. Those who come out of the grave will be those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment. You see, this statement by Jesus came at a time in his ministry when the Jews were trying to figure out every way possible to get rid of him. They didn't like his message. And though they accused him of blasphemy by making himself equal with God, Jesus emphatically insisted, I'm not doing anything on my own. Even his own resurrection wasn't his own doing. He's now making his audience aware of the outcomes of life. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life. Those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment. We tend to forget that the New Testament presents the faithful disciple of Jesus, that the resurrection and his coming are to be seen in a positive light. It's called life. It's the eager anticipation that is an encouragement. It is an it's an eternal blessing of inheriting that hope. It's being presented blameless before God. It's a relief granted from our suffering. It's being in the presence of the Lord in the glory of his might. Christ's return will find God glorified in us when we're raised from the dead. Such a positive view of the New Testament that encourages and motivates us to remain faithful to the life given us by Jesus is the focus. So we need to remember what makes this so real. We see that the resurrection is light. It is life. It is hope. It is God's power being demonstrated, and it will be demonstrated. And the resurrection is our destiny. There is one verse that, because of the resurrection of Jesus, is one of my all-time favorite. And I want to share it with you this morning as we close. And it's 1 Corinthians 15:58. And after Paul, in a big, long chapter, had talked about the significance of Jesus' resurrection and why we believe in our own resurrection to come, he ends it with this. Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. The resurrection of Jesus is not only something to believe in, but it provides the foundation for a life of purpose, and realizing that everything you do in ministry and in labor for the Lord is never forgotten by God. It gives your life purpose and meaning and a reason to be here and a reason to live. We can live because he lives. If you need to come forward this morning wanting to place your heart at the foot of the cross and to have a living Lord live in your heart, won't you respond while we stand and sing?